Hey, U.S. history students, it's Mr. Baker again. This is another installment of Baker's Corner. This is our fourth lesson of 4 with World War II. And so what we're going to focus on today is one of the big things that we talked a little bit, actually quite a bit about in our study of World War I, guys. And that's the way, how does a war have potential to affect the home front, right? And we said that I think if you go back to our last, one of our last lessons, guys, that one of the things with the home front is we got to understand things like the political side of it. We have to understand the way it affects people. You know, we talked about in the last session how my grandfather went into World War II as a member of the U.S. Navy, and therefore he left behind his wife, a son, my aunt who was born in January of 1941, and then also during the war when he was abroad fighting in the Pacific, my mom was born in July of 1944. So there's going to be a lot of really important things that are very interesting, some common parallels, with in regards to women and minority groups and things like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So if you think about it, one of the big things with war in this case is how do we, first of all, inform the public, and how do we also give them an understanding about how they can actually support the conflict in a variety of different ways. And so you'll notice, guys, you can pause your screen here if you want to, but we've got the good old fashioned war poster similar to the Uncle Sam I Want You. You're going to see a lot of these, you buy them, we'll fly them kind of things with buying war bonds, pamphlets, airdrops that are pretty much literally the way that it sounds, guys, dropping these, kind of like pamphlets and things from literally the air. And then also, of course, as you can see here, and we're going to watch a very short, brief excerpt or clip, and that is the idea of a newsreel. Now, I don't know if any of you guys have ever heard of a newsreel, but I want you to think of our study of the 1920s. So what form of mass media is becoming even bigger that's going to have a large effect on, kind of presenting ideas? And a lot of you are like, well, yeah, the radio, FDR is using the fireside chats to inform the public about things involving the war. And guys, while that is true, right, there's no question about that, the newsreels are going to be things that if you were attending, let's say, a movie back then, whatever movie it would have been, it was not that uncommon for you to actually have a short clip, right, or kind of a short little, almost like an advertisement that actually would show you, what was going on, how to kind of rouse additional support for American involvement, okay, how to inform us what was going on, okay. And so let's take a real quick look, guys, at a newsreel, and then we'll come back to some of the bigger things that we'll look at, okay. So as you can see here, this is one that is pretty interesting, I think. America, how we're informing the American people, okay. And so let's take a look at this. You can obviously hear the language or the music, very patriotic. Okay, so guys, you can clearly see, I think it's very safe to say that when you're looking at these newsreels, the one thing I think we need to really keep in the back of our minds is that I think, in my view, they're very effective, right? But what stood out about them, right? What stands about them to me is that you notice the very patriotic music, but then if you look at the latter part of the clip that we watched, you notice like kind of a dramatic movement to Japan, attacking parts of Alaska, etc. Okay, so guys, think about it. If you're really watching these, it's a good way to kind of engage the audience with what's going on beyond just simply a poster. Now, with that being said, okay, what kind of things are going to affect our country moving further into this war? And guys, there's a lot of parallels to some of the home front basics that we looked at with World War I. There are military effects through the draft. There's economic effects with the government taking more control of production, as we'll see here in a second. There's obviously political effects as well, as we'll see with some of the decisions that FDR and Congress make regarding laws and acts and executive orders. And then, of course, you're also going to have, guys, a really big effect on, the people, right? How are women going to be affected, et cetera. Okay, so militarily, just really quick, you are going to have a Selective Service Act that is reinforced. The controversy a little bit, guys, with this act was that this was passed in 1940. The year is not there, but a lot of you guys are wondering, okay, well, why would that be controversial? Well, guys, think about it like this. Pearl Harbor doesn't happen until December 7th of 1941. Right? So that's going to be something that really, I think, is important for us to keep in the front of our minds. We do not have a state of declared war yet. Okay. So remember, you're going to have some people like Charles Lindbergh, et cetera, that are very much on the opinion that, there should be no, draft, et cetera, at all in some people's cases, but particularly if you're not in a state of a declared war. Okay. Now, originally, this draft is going to be applying, I think it was to ages 21 to 35. Okay. So you're looking at a pretty sizable amount of people. Okay. And therefore, guys, what do they also do about a year, 2-3 years into the conflict? They're going to pass what very well could have been one of the most influential acts, especially toward education, guys, in the history of the United States Congress. And that's what we call the GI Bill. Okay, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this before, but it was basically passed so that, people that were in service, in this war and beyond, they could get money for their education. It also created lower interest loans. Now, a lot of you guys are like, well, man, this was passed in 1943, 1944. Does it have a long-term effect? And the answer is, guys, absolutely. Okay. Veterans are going to serve in future wars and also in the military moving forward, have the opportunity to have the GI Bill. And so as you can imagine, what's going to happen, guys, if these people have more money to go to school? You guessed it. They're going to be going to college, trade school, et cetera. And guys, what we notice is that the education of the country is going to expand quite a bit. This is going to have a very large impact on especially the post-war period entering the 50s and also beyond. Okay. I don't know if any of you guys have grandparents that went to college, maybe they're in their 70s or whatever, but my father-in-law, who I'll tell a story about more in a second, who was 88 when he passed away just last year, actually fought in the Korean War, and he actually took advantage of the GI Bill. So it's a very big thing to enhance that. Okay. So it is kind of a social thing in education-wise, but it also applied to people that were in military. Okay. Now, what about economic conversion? Well, guys, think about what we talked about with World War I. Okay. The only big difference is that if you look back at the 20s, we have made this transition to a more consumer-based economy, but you got to remember what has really since happened since the 20s. Well, we've been in the midst of a Great Depression. Okay. And so, there's a case to be made that when you're looking at the idea of a lot of these things related to the economy and change, maybe the people are not going to be quite as affected in the same way, because a lot of them are used to doing without more. Why? Because they're a part of this Great Depression generation that's grown up. Okay. However, guys, that does not mean that the government is not going to have a really essential role. And so what do? Well, they create what's called the War Productions Board. Okay, feel free to pause this if you need to. Okay, and this is very similar to World War One, where the government is going to basically closely monitor, all right, regulate, whatever word you want to use, a lot of the production regarding things like tanks, airplanes, weapons, uniforms, of course, food, etc. Okay, and guys, what we notice is that this War Productions Board, Congress gives them a lot of power, but they also give the president a lot of power. So they're going to pass acts that basically give the president, guys, a whole lot of leeway, if you will, with the idea of doing things that's going to try in his best interest to actually allow for the country to actually succeed and prosper and have a positive outcome to winning this war. Okay. You also have to obviously fund the war. So we're going to have the war bond campaigns that we talked about during World War I. The idea of buying these bonds, paying for them then, waiting for them to mature in value, and then eventually selling them back. So this is a way that the government created almost like a loan to be able to actually pay for the war and guaranteeing money for people in the longer term. You also had an increase in taxes, right? So that's going to be a pretty common thing that we see. And then we're also, guys, going to see the result of deficit spending, right? So what is deficit spending? It's going to be spending, as we looked at during the Depression with FDR's New Deal, that is going above and beyond government expenditures, or I'm sorry, government revenue, pardon me. Okay. So you notice that when you have deficit spending, guys, you are actually spending more than you're bringing in, whether it's taxes or fees or whatever other source of revenue it might be. Now, how do you get people on board with, being in favor of actually sacrificing, et cetera, and also having the same amount of things to actually make the war work? Well, guys, look here. Rationing is going to reappear. Rationing things like metals, gasoline. We know that we're a more mobile culture by the 1930s and the 40s than we were in the teens. Okay. So guys, it's not that uncommon for, if you Google like ration books of World War II, you're going to see rationing that dealt with things like milk, eggs, gallons of gas, etc. And a lot of you are like, well, man, how many people were driving back then? Well, a sizable number. But guys, you got to remember, it's not like now where each family is going to have probably 2 to 3, maybe even more cars. You had usually one family car. Okay. And in my mom's family, guys, the only person who actually drove up until the 70s was actually my grandfather, as far as her parents. And so when he's away, serving his country, my grandmother was taking the kids on buses and things like that. And you got to remember, I grew up in a small area of Ohio. It wasn't like a large city, right? Like a Columbus or a New York City or Cleveland or somewhere like that actually had a lot of really sophisticated subways and things like that. Okay. A lot of you might be wondering, okay, Mr. Baker, what about these victory gardens? These are actually very similar to what they sound, very patriotic. They were also sometimes referred to as Liberty Gardens. But the idea is you're trying to get people, guys, to take ownership of basically farming and also growing their own crops. So you know what? Plow like a 10 by 10 area in your backyard or whatever it was and actually grow, things like carrots, tomatoes, squash, whatever it might be. And I remember talking to my father-in-law, I just referenced, they always had a garden when my wife was growing up. And also when he was younger. And I remember asking him, because he was born in 1931. So I remember, guys, him telling me stories about being a middle schooler toward the end of the war and, having like a lot of these bond campaigns active in their school and people coming to sell bonds. But they also really promoted this idea of grow your own stuff, right? Which makes a whole lot of sense. Okay. And so I remember asking him, I said, well, one of the reasons why you had a garden, partly due to the Depression and also very much due to the nationalism that came out of World War II. And he said both of those things were accurate. Okay. So guys, just a quick note on this. Whenever you hear people use the expression for the World War II and also the Depression generation as America's greatest generation, there's a lot of things. I mean, imagine they lived through 2 pretty significant crises, which I think gives them a lot of respect. Anyway, moving on. So to kind of end our lesson today, what about the social impact? Feel free to pause your screen, okay, your video for a moment to get these details down, okay? But guys, if you think back to what we're talking about with the idea of social, even go back to World War I or previous decades, we're talking about the effects on people, whether it's gender, whether it's ethnicity, something along those lines. Okay. In this case, we're talking really about gender and ethnicity. Okay. And so these are not necessarily in any particular order of importance, but we will talk about these in a little bit more depth on a few more slides moving forward. Okay. But guys, I want you to look here, the code talkers. Okay. So I don't know if any of you have ever heard of these, but this is a group of Native Americans. Okay. Now, a lot of them were Navajo, right? But I remember a few years ago, just a quick story, when I went to the Grand Canyon and we went on a tour and we had a Hopi Native American tribesman that was actually giving us our tour. And he was talking about different tribes that had settled in that area. And one of them, of course, was the Hopi, but another one was the Navajo. And so I thought I would be really, knowledgeable as a history teacher to bring up the Navajo code talkers. And I said, so, we're a lot of them actually from here. And this Hopi was like, well, some, but one thing I need to tell you about is that the Navajo, while they were code talkers, they were not the only tribe that actually were involved in the code talking. So the Hopi were amongst others. Okay. Now, a lot of you are like, okay, well, what in the world would a code talker have done? They were basically radio men. All right. But the thing that made this guy so significant in this war was the Japanese, as a lot of you guys might already know, were really good at breaking codes, right? And so they kept basically deciphering codes. And so the United States, trying to win the Pacific Campaign was like, okay, well, what do we do? And so they figured out that if you could take the Navajo language and basically create a code with it, okay, so in other words, certain words like turtle would mean tank, stuff like that, and you actually create a code that you can actually use to relay messages, that there was a strong chance that that code would not actually be broken, okay, by the Japanese or Germany, whoever it was. And so they did that. And guys, the cool thing is that these Navajo code talkers, I think, in my mind, do not get the credit that they deserve, because a lot of the Pacific Campaign guys with island hopping, etc., are going to be extremely important when it comes to being able to relay those codes with places like Saipan, the Philippines, places like that. And so, guys, these code talkers make a very important contribution to the war effort. Okay. So imagine, you've got these people, a lot of them at that point were living on the reservations. And there's a wonderful film. It's got a little bit of language to it, and it's got also some violence. Okay, but it's called Wind Talkers. It came out, I don't know, a little bit less than 20 years ago. And it does a really interesting job showing you guys some things, not just with the code talking, but also with some of the unfortunate prejudice that actually was directed towards some of these Native Americans while they were actually doing their jobs in the campaigns. All right. So anyway, there is going to be some prejudice that comes out of that. Okay. Mexican Americans. Now, remember what we said in our study, guys, of the Great Depression. This is one time period where we see a sizable amount of people that are actually leaving the country. In other words, they're immigrating elsewhere. Why is that a big deal? Well, the war comes a knocking. We need people to work in factories and farms and places like that. Okay. And so we got to actually kind of figure out a way to draw people back in. So guess what they developed? They developed what was called the Bracero program. Okay. This is kind of like a guest worker program. A lot of these people did remain in the United States long term. Okay. But a lot of them were actually kind of recruited to actually come back to the United States. Now, some of them had been born here and left. Some of them actually had family members that they actually were also living with that actually came with them. But guys, what a lot of these Mexican workers did, a lot of them did settle in parts of the American Southwest, right? So parts of Texas, parts of California, et cetera. Okay. But they made a very important contribution, guys, from the standpoint of work and also contributing especially to agricultural work. You'll see in the 40s and the 50s and 60s moving forward that you're going to have a really big rise. Just a real quick story for later on, guys. In the 60s, especially with what is called eventually the Chicano movement, and that's going to be led by a gentleman by the name of Cesar Chavez, who is actually a big advocate of what eventually became known as the United Farm Workers, or the UFW. Okay, so very important. Now, with women, guys, think about what we said about World War I. Women are working in the factories. They're going into these places in larger detail. Guys, in this time period, we're going to see exactly the same thing to a larger scale. This is a big deal. Why? Because a lot of women, guys, are now, of course, able to vote because of the 19th Amendment. Okay. And therefore, you're going to see a lot of these women that are actually working in defense factories. Okay. The Rosie the Riveter image, which I think we'll see on one of our future slides, is probably one of the most, in my opinion, powerful images that comes out of this. I think of my grandmother, who was not a defense factory worker, but again, working a full-time job, taking care of 3 kids, two of which were in diapers during this war. All right. Women really did a lot of things to contribute to this war effort. All right. If you ever get a chance, guys, to YouTube this or to Google, one of the really interesting stories with the Rosie the Riveter, and this woman, I believe, is still alive. She's 101. Her name is Eleanor Otto. And guys, the story behind her is really just awesome. Okay, because it tells a little bit about how she got her job at this Boeing factory out in California back in the 40s. And actually, she was working into her 90s at the same company. All right. So, guys, a lot of these women, if you can imagine, they take these jobs, and a lot of them are going to be like, man, I like working. I like the idea of actually having an income, etc. And so there is going to be some friction and some disagreement, okay, when it comes to the idea of what happens when somebody, for example, like my grandfather comes back from the war, right, and he wants to be able to work again, in his case, in the shoe factory. There's going to be some considerable disagreement over how we transition there, okay? So you're going to see some of this pop up again with some of the issues, guys, of women's roles and equality and different things with like that idea of kind of like culture wars with gender equality and also gender roles as we further our post-World War II study. Okay. As far as African Americans, really interesting, guys. You are going to see a great migration. Okay, if I can show you this map. This great migration, as you can see, it's a very similar kind of thing in the 40s and the 30s as well. You'll notice a lot of these states in the red are ones that traditionally had a lot of those Jim Crow laws, voter restrictions, etc. And guys, what do we notice probably one of the bigger changes in the Great Migration between World War I and World War II? To me, it's going to be that you're going to see a greater amount of migration westward. Okay, so it's not to say that you didn't have any westward in World War I, but I think you're going to see, guys, a lot more movement into parts of California. This down here would be close to San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, etc. Okay, but you are still going to see some considerable movement, as you can see up here, into these states, into places like Michigan. That's Detroit. That's Cleveland, Ohio. That's Columbus. Indianapolis would be about right there. Chicago. Okay. And then over here would be, if you take a look, guys, at my cursor, that would be Philadelphia. Coast New York is here. And then also over here would be Boston. Okay. And so it's a very important thing to keep in mind. Now, one thing that's also very cool, I think, is that there is going to be a push to really show that there is still a lot of progress to be made from the standpoint of civil rights. Okay. So if you take a look at this double V campaign, okay, the one thing, guys, that you notice with the double V campaign is that a lot of you are like, well, what does the V stand for? Glad you asked that. V stands for victory. But what is it victory over? It's victory over racism. But where is racism in connection to, obviously, the war? It's going to be, kind of targeting, if you will, some of the issues that came out of like Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, places like that. And of course, they're also going to be like, hey, we're fighting this war to kind of protect democracy and all these different things. But yet we still see sizable areas of the United States that are seeing a lot of these problems. It's kind of like fast forwarding the clock to the 1960s. Just a quick story on this. When we see like some of the arguments that people like Martin Luther King Jr. make, by the way, not long before his unfortunate passing, okay, when, he's talking about, hey, we're abroad fighting in Vietnam for democracy and things like that. But yet, we're not looking at places that are in, I think he uses the expression Southwest Georgia and places like that equally have a lot of these, similar issues. Okay. So they're trying to bring to the forefront some of these things. Okay. And so a lot of leadership pops up. W.B. Du Bois is still around. You've got another figure that pops up that we won't talk a lot about, but you can research. His name is A. Philip Randolph, who's another really important figure. Okay. And then also one of the groups, guys, that's affected by the social effects of this war, perhaps the most, you could argue, is going to be Japanese Americans. The internment camps, the question that people ask is, were a lot of these people a true, real danger? That's something that obviously you see a lot of these people that were not even first generation immigrants at this point. Okay. And therefore what happens? You still have a lot of targeting. Ergo, what do we see? FDR issues what's called the Executive Order 9066. Okay. Well, I don't know if you need to memorize the number. You're welcome to. It's kind of important to at least keep in mind that it was an executive order. But guys, essentially what FDR did is this is going to be what makes the internment camps basically, possible. Okay. As you can imagine, interning these Japanese in these places like Manzanar, Topaz, okay, places like that, Grenada, you'll notice, Grenada, pardon me, you'll notice that a lot of these guys are west of the Mississippi River. Okay, if you take a look at this, like Rower, Jerome, etc. Okay, and so what do we notice, guys? We notice that these are going to be areas that they rounded up a lot of these people. They lost their property. In a lot of cases, you could argue they lost their pride as well. Okay. And what happens is that they were interned. So the question, guys, that pops up, very similar, I might mention, to the Schenck case. Not exact, but I would argue very similar with the Schenck case in World War I is it goes back to the issue of protecting civil liberties. Okay. So the argument is that are these civil liberties being actually compromised or whatever? And this is the reason why we have the Korematsu case. Okay, so from the Korematsu, this is in 1944. It's going to, of course, take this case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And at the time, the Supreme Court is going to act in the favor of the United States government. Okay, so the case that you can make here is that, again, it's a time of emergency, and ergo, the government is acting in a time of emergency. Now, as you can imagine, this creates a lot of stir. It creates a lot of criticism. It creates a lot of controversy. Down the line, you're going to have, like in the 50s and the 60s moving forward, this is going to be resurfacing for good reason. Okay. And so you're going to have certain groups that advocate, like the Japanese American Citizens League, I believe it was called, okay, JACL for short. And they're going to really advocate that there be attention brought to the wrongness of this. And in the 1980s, as we'll look at, guys, later in the year, there is, in fact, going to be a pretty significant, I think it's safe to say, guys, a very significant, not pretty, a very significant act that was passed by Congress that recognizes, for the most part, that this was handled inappropriately. Okay. There's the pictures, guys, of the Rosie the Riveter that you actually would have seen, like in a lot of cartoons, a lot of posters, as you can see, things like that. Okay. So again, very similar. They're going to promote women working in a lot of defense factories, things like that. And guys, remember, a lot of this propaganda, as you can see on the left here, is going to be very patriotic, red, white, and blue, bringing attention to doing your part, whether it's a female working. Okay. And if you're kind of wondering where does kind of like this Rosie the Riveter kind of like a label or nickname came from, excuse me. Okay. It actually came from a song. Okay. So it's kind of a neat little song. It's very catchy. Rosie had a boyfriend, Charlie. Charlie, he was a Marine. Um, you know, Rosie supporting Charlie or something like that, working all the time on a riving machine all day long, whether rain or shine, et cetera, et cetera. I won't sing much longer because I don't want your ears to bleed, guys. But you notice a lot of really, I think, enhanced use of some of the same forms of mass media, but also those that are going to be enhanced because of the nature of technology improving. Okay. Last but not least, you can't really talk about the effects of World War II unless we also look at the unfortunate side of the Holocaust. Okay. So if you look at this, guys, you'll notice one of the bigger criticisms of FDR outside of the involvement of the Japanese internment is going to be, some people would argue that he does not really do enough to kind of really address the Holocaust and the atrocities toward the Jewish and other population guys in Europe until, well into the war. Okay. So you've got this final solution that Hitler kind of gets, it doesn't start like during the war. It kind of starts before with like the Kristallnacht and some of the laws that they were passing to restrict Jewish, merchants and things like that. But guys, as we move into the war, you'll notice like the final solution is eventually put forth. And guys, you'll notice again, if you take a look at the map here, a lot of these concentration camps are going to be, as you can see, in Poland. So Auschwitz, that's the one that probably, I would say, if you've heard of one, that very well could be the one that you've seen the most attention brought to. Okay. So you'll notice like about 2.9 million Jewish people in Poland are going to be affected by the Holocaust, about 1 million in the Soviet Union. And then also you'll notice a sizable number in Hungary, Romania, and then as you can see, other parts of Europe as well. Okay. One of the criticisms of FDR is that there is going to be what's called a war refugees board. Okay. But as you can imagine, one of the criticisms is going to be that they don't really do enough earlier in the war. So in other words, guys, if they would have maybe started a process or some way of trying to address this problem earlier when they knew it was going on, would there have been as many atrocities, et cetera, et cetera? Okay. So anyway, something to keep in mind, because post-World War II, this becomes an issue, right? How do you deal with crimes against humanity by the Germany, excuse me. That also applies to the Japanese government as well. Okay. The UN is going to have something to say about what eventually became known as the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Okay. And so what do we notice, guys? We notice that eventually there's pressure put to eventually allow for the establishment of a Jewish, homeland that would eventually will be made into the state or country of Israel in 1948. Okay. So therefore, it's a pretty important thing for us to keep in mind. And that is our presentation, guys. It's a lot to think about. I realize that, but ask yourself the question as far as your focus on World War II. How does this relate to what we've talked about before with grouping different themes within the home front, the political themes, the military, the cultural things, or the social things, excuse me, and then also some of the things that dealt with the economy. Okay, as always, it's been a pleasure to be with you today. I hope you had a great session. I know I did. Feel free to email me at bakerd@franklineconomy.org. And stay safe. And I hope, guys, that you have a great lesson. Next installment, we will transition to the post-war period as we examine anything from the origins of the Cold War to also the politics that came about from the war, and also moving into the Truman administration and beyond. Take care and have a good one. Bye-bye.